Chinese Religion Part 1, Early History of China. This presentation covers the beginning of Chinese civilization and religion. Traditional Chinese religion is sometimes called Sanjiao in Chinese. Literally, that means three traditions. Now, many Chinese people today do not consider themselves religious. Some are Christian or Muslim or Buddhist, or a small number are Taoist. But some of them, even though they may not consider themselves religious, they may participate in what you could call a kind of folk religion, where they make offerings to their ancestors or even to a being like Confucius, or occasionally go to a Buddhist or Taoist temple, or even make an offering to a city god or an earth god. So it is still a part of Chinese culture. Traditionally, though, many Chinese combined multiple religions, especially Taoism, Confucianism, and Buddhism. So that's why they developed the term Sanjiao to refer to the three main religious traditions that were present in their culture. There were different ways these different teachings were combined, or there were different ways of conceiving their relation. One way that Chinese people traditionally thought of this is that Taoism is a religion or a tradition focused on self-cultivation, creating, you could say, maybe mental and physical health and longevity, sort of training your vital energy. Confucianism was more focused on the social and political, maintaining your duties to your family and to society, maintaining the social order. And Buddhism was thought of as mainly applying to the afterlife because of the Buddhist doctrine of rebirth and the notion that you could transcend samsara. So sometimes people would practice all three religions, but kind of give them different parts of their life or parts of their existence. You'll also notice the term Jiao is translated as tradition. It can refer to a religion, but especially Taoism and Confucianism, they also have philosophical aspects. So there's kind of a blurred line between philosophies and religions in traditional Chinese culture. The general practice of combining religions is called religious syncretism by religious studies scholars. And so traditional Chinese religion is highly syncretic. One illustration of the Sanjiao concept is a popular motif of Chinese art called the vinegar tasters. In this image, you see three figures tasting a pot of vinegar, and they each detect a different flavor in the vinegar. Vinegar is chosen because it is a commonly consumed substance that has kind of a complex flavor with different notes in it. So the Buddha, who you can see on the left of this image, senses bitterness, or the vinegar tastes bitter to the Buddha. This is a reflection of the Buddhist idea that suffering exists and it's a problem. So it's kind of like responding to our ordinary life, maybe in a kind of negative way, focusing on the suffering. You know, Buddhism, they also teach that the suffering can be totally transcended. So that's also kind of an optimistic or a sweet aspect of Buddhism. But nevertheless, it is true that Buddhism looks at the material or the conventional social world primarily as something to be transcended, primarily as something that's a problem. Confucius tastes the vinegar as sour, and this probably reflects the traditional Confucian idea that is somewhat pessimistic about human nature, in the sense that humans have no natural virtue or natural wisdom, that we have to train ourselves, educate ourselves into virtue and wisdom. Whereas Lao Tzu, who you can see on the right, he tastes the vinegar as sweet. And this reflects the Taoist idea that the original natural state is beneficial or good, and that has to be restored. You'll notice these three tasters are making Lao Tzu, the Taoist philosopher or teacher seemed the kind of most positive or optimistic. So you could say the vinegar taster's motif seems to reflect a kind of Taoist perspective. But it does illustrate this idea of the three traditions being combined, and of the Buddha, Confucius, and Lao Tzu all being traditionally respected by Chinese. Another really important concept to Chinese religion is the Tao. Literally, this term means a way or a path that you could walk. However, in ancient times, at least going back to the time of Confucius, it also could be used to refer to a way of life, a way of patterning your life based on moral principles, based on ritual or ceremony. And another meaning of Tao is a way of ordering society. So that could relate to politics, political philosophy. And then an additional meaning of Tao is the way things are in the universe. So this gets to questions of metaphysics, the fundamental nature of reality, or cosmology, the overall structure of the universe. And so Tao became a really important concept in all of these senses in both traditional Chinese philosophy and religion. So you could think of the three religions as giving three different Taos, three different ways of life or accounts of the universe. So this map shows you the modern nation of China in yellow. Chinese civilization started along the Huanghe or Yellow River in the North China Plain. You can also see the Yangtze River to the south of the Yellow River. This was another source of Chinese civilization, and that in southern China, along the Yangtze and to the south, there was another kind of ancient center of civilization, or at least of agriculture. Now, the Chinese language, culture, the political history is centered more in the north. However, modern DNA studies have shown that the Chinese population is a kind of mix between the northern and southern ancestral populations. In the north, a great culture arose that was based on the cultivation of millet and other grains, whereas in the south, rice cultivation was the primary source of the diet. But eventually, these two populations merged, although under the sort of political and cultural leadership of the North. And from my understanding is that modern Chinese, they're considered one culture, the Han culture. But if you look at their ancestry, in the South, there's slightly more of the Southern ancestral population. And in the North, there's more of the Northern ancestral population, but there's kind of degrees of mixing all along the way. But we're going to focus this on the civilization that emerged in the North China Plain. Before we get to the early history of China, let's briefly consider the traditional creation myth. Actually, there's no single creation story or myth that was universally believed in China in ancient times or traditionally. But this is a common one, and you often see just this story with slight variance to it. So in the beginning, there was an empty, formless kind of void, you could say, called Wu Ji. So this is often symbolized as a kind of empty circle. So it's a kind of, you could think of it as nothingness, but it has the potential for becoming. This idea would also play a role in Taoist philosophy, the concept of Wu or emptiness. So eventually the Wu Ji kind of coalesces into what you could call a kind of fullness, but one that is greatly united. It's a wholeness, a fullness, a oneness called the Dai Ji, which is often translated into English as supreme ultimate. And so you could think of this as a kind of being that has a perfect balance or mix of different elements or forces that would later be separated, but here they're combined into unity. The Daiji is thought of as forming a cosmic or universal egg from which a being called Pangu is born. So you can think of Pangu as kind of gestating in this cosmic egg of Daiji. On the right is a picture of Pangu. He's usually depicted as a hairy giant with horns, somewhat similar to the figure of Ymir in ancient Norse mythology, this giant from which the world is created, essentially. Pangu begins his life by separating out yin or dark energy or substance from yang or light energy or substance. These were originally combined evenly or smoothly in the Taiji, and he uses his axe actually to separate them. And the yin, the relatively heavy and murky stuff, becomes the earth, and the yang, the relatively light and clear stuff, becomes the heaven. He lives for many thousands of years, and eventually he dies, though. And the story is that the various parts of his body become different parts of the world. This is the real strong parallel to the Ymir story of Norse mythology. So Pangu's breath becomes wind and clouds, his blood becomes the rivers, his voice becomes thunder, his eyes become the sun and the moon, the fur on his skin becomes forests, the little fleas on his body become animals, etc. Also born from his body is a being known as Hua Shu. And Hua Shu, his main role is actually creating or giving birth to a twin brother and sister named Fu Shi and Nu Hua. So Fu Shi and Nu Hua are the first of the so-called three sovereigns. Three sovereigns are these mythical godlike beings that presided over the world after the death of Pangu. And they were followed by another set of legendary beings called the Five Emperors. So the three sovereigns are the twins Fu Shi and Nu Hua, and then the later ruler Shen Nong. So Fu Shi and Nu Hua are sometimes depicted as humans. You can see in the image on the right of Fu Shi, he looks like a normal human, except he's sort of just garbed in grasses, so he looks kind of like primitive or something like that. But they're also sometimes depicted as having the top half or the face of a human and the bottom half of a serpent. So they're not really thought of as truly human, although they're the creators of humans. So there's different stories told about them, but they lived on this mountain called Kunlun Shan, which is a kind of mythical, symbolic center of the world, what religious studies scholars call an axis mundi. And they basically, even though they were brother and sister, they became husband and wife. But they created humans by shaping clay into little figures or figurines. And then they miraculously gave those statues or figurines life. And those became the first humans. So Fu Shi and Nu Hua contributed to the culture of these humans. In particular, Fu Shi taught them how to survive by hunting, fishing, and trapping. He also invented the Bagua, or the 8 trigrams, used in later Chinese divination. You can see them before the seated figure of Fu Shi in the picture on the right, faintly drawn into the ground. One of the main stories told about Fu Shi's sister Nu Hua is that there was this great fight between another figure named Chuan Shu, he was actually one of the 5 emperors, and a monster of watery chaos called Gong Gong. Chuan Shu eventually defeated Gong Gong, but Gong Gong was essentially threatened to destabilize the cosmos, to bring the order down. This overall story has parallels in other religions and cultures where you have this kind of monstrous figure associated with the primordial ocean or kind of chaos, a watery chaos, who's defeated by sort of an upright hero figure or some god. But after this battle, the earth and the heavens were actually all in disarray. So Nu Hua had to end some flooding and had to restore the pillars of heaven. So in the traditional Chinese account, heaven is resting upon the earth, but it's actually held up by one or more of these pillars. And so those were restored by Nu Hua. So Fu Shi and Nu Hua were basically worshipped as a god and goddess in later Chinese religion. Nu Hua is associated with the creation and with cosmic harmony because she restored the heavens. Um, After Fuxi and Nuwa, Shen Nong became the ruler of the humans. So these beings are called the three sovereigns. That implies they had some sort of rulership over the first people. And Shen Nong continues this tradition of adding to the culture of society. So Fuxi developed the simplest or the most basic form of society, which is based on hunting, fishing, and trapping. Shen Nong, whose name literally means spirit farmer, he invented farming, so the cultivation of grains and domestication of animals. And he also was the first one to use herbs as medicine. So he's regarded as the one of the originators of traditional Chinese medicine. The five emperors ruled after the three sovereigns, and these beings are more seemingly human. You know, there's kind of a fuzzy boundary between God and human in traditional Chinese religion because of the custom of ancestor veneration or ancestor worship. It was common to worship departed ancestors as spirits, and there were these kind of cultural ancestors like the five emperors, and you could regard them as, deceased human spirits that are still remembered and revered by people, but functionally speaking, they're worshipped similar to how you would worship a god. And there were also humans who, after their death, could become deified as gods. So there's kind of a fuzzy boundary sometimes between ancestor spirits and gods in the traditional Chinese religion. So the Yellow Emperor, he's a legendary figure, but traditionally he was regarded as a historical person and is the ancestor of the Chinese people. So he added to the culture by creating armies and laws and punishments. He's also regarded as the inventor of alchemy, which is called dawn in China. This word means cinnabar, which is a compound of mercury. That was one of the main ingredients used in alchemical potions that were thought to extend your life. So the Yellow Emperor became a very big part of Chinese religion. He was succeeded by Yao. So Yao invented the game Wei Qi, which is a really popular traditional Chinese game. He also hired astronomers to basically originate Chinese astrology. So they took very careful observations of the stars and planets and so on. His son was a man named Dan Chu. However, instead of allowing Dan Chu to inherit his rule, Dan Chu was someone who was kind of a womanizer, a man of low morals. So Yao thought instead it would be better to appoint someone who had the virtue and wisdom that would be desirable in a ruler. And he found that in his chief minister, Shun. So this set the precedent for meritocracy, which is having those with the proper education or state of character taking over the government rather than just having the son of the previous ruler inherit the throne. Now, throughout Chinese history, they did have dynasties of hereditary kings and emperors. So at the very top, they basically did continue to use hereditary succession. But there was a principle that instead of just allowing nobles or people that you are related to serve under a king or emperor, it was best to appoint those who actually had the skill, the knowledge, the qualification, and the state of character. So Shun's backstory was that he actually came from a kind of troubled home. His mother died when he was young. His father remarried, but his stepmother was really kind of deceitful and lying and had it out for Shun. She didn't like him. He had a stepbrother, or a half-brother rather, who would always be causing trouble and doing things wrong. And he would lie about, blame it on Shun. And his stepmother, who really knew what was going on, she would blame all the bad things that Shun's half-brother had done on Shun. And Shun's father, because he was blind, unfortunately, couldn't see what had actually happened. He was also kind of foolish and ignorant, so he would just believe his wife, his second wife. And so Shun basically was verbally abused, you could say, for decades. But despite all of this abuse, he never ceased to treat his family members with the utmost respect. And so he was able to triumph over adversity. He didn't sink to their level. He became an educated and virtuous scholar. And Yao saw his merit and basically appointed him to ever greater positions of authority. He eventually became the prime minister or the chief government official in Yao's government. And then after his death, Shun succeeded Yao. So this is kind of a story used by later Confucians to illustrate the importance of propriety and respect for your family, even if they're not treating you well, and also how that can propel you towards success and influence in society. So after the five emperors, there was a dynasty or a succession of kings called the Xia dynasty. Now, this is a dynasty recognized by traditional Chinese historiography, that is, the traditional histories that have been collected starting in ancient times. Modern historians no longer really regard this dynasty as having actually existed, so it's a legendary dynasty. The stories told about it were not literally true, much like the earlier stories of the three sovereigns and the five emperors, which you can see have these kind of legendary qualities to them. Nevertheless, there was a civilization in China at this time, so the traditional dates of the Xia dynasty correspond to a period called Early Dou culture. It was a Bronze Age civilization that emerged along the Yellow River. So according to the traditional account, a king or emperor named Yu the Great founded the Xia dynasty. And one of his main accomplishments was to dig irrigation canals to help channel these dammed floodwaters. So the Yellow River had flooded and it was ruining all the crops. And so he was the one who figured out how to coordinate everyone's labor to dig these irrigation canals that would reduce the flooding. And irrigation canals are great because they also help water other lands. So this idea of productively channeling otherwise destructive natural forces, that became a kind of symbol in both Confucianism and Taoism. The Xia dynasty continued for several centuries, but according to the traditional account, it ended after its last ruler, Jie, became really tyrannical and evil. So he was basically really indulgent and abusive. The typical way that tyrants are depicted in the Chinese historiography is that they're indulging their senses, indulging their appetites. So they're living for sex and for eating. They have mistresses who may have influence over them. They're very harsh in their punishments. If someone tries to correct them, they torture or execute them, etc. This became a kind of standard type. So this may have been projected, this type of story was probably projected backward on Jie by later Confucian historians. But according to the traditional account, because he was such an abusive and bad ruler, he lost the support of heaven. There's a concept called Tianming, which means the command or the mandate of heaven. And Confucians traditionally believed that heaven supports good kings and rulers. So the harvest will be good, there won't be plague, society will be prosperous, and their followers will have high morale, will want to support them. But when the king turns bad, heaven removes its support. So it's as if the natural forces conspire against the ruler. And this can actually make it easier for someone to overthrow them. In the ideal case, when someone has truly lost the mandate of heaven, someone who rises as a rebel against them barely even has to fight. Support for the previous ruler just kind of melts away, and the new ruler comes into power with the support of nature, the support of heaven behind them. So according to the traditional accounts, someone named Sage King Tong was able to defeat Jie and found the next dynasty, which is called the Shang dynasty. The Shang dynasty does correspond to an actual historical period that's been discovered by modern archaeologists, and the Shang is basically a name for the ruling clan of this dynasty. It lasted from around 1750 to 1046 BC. They grew up along the Yellow River. They were successors to earlier Bronze Age cultures. Their main grain was millet, but they grew other grains as well. The basis of the military power of the ruling class, the Shang, may have been these chariots. So around about 1500 and after, chariots come to China from Central Asian nomads. And so it's not that the Shang were necessarily originally nomads from Central Asia, but once the technology was brought there, the Chinese armed themselves with chariots to help fight off the nomads. And they also used it, the rulers of China used this chariot technology to help, attain dominance in battle. This is a picture of a tomb of a Shang lord, and you can see there are many bronze vessels, like receptacles, like urns and things in this tomb. These served a really important religious function. So one of the ways that they were used in rituals is placing offerings to the gods, the spirits, in the vessel. And they were also kind of like status symbols because it was expensive to accumulate that much bronze together to make one of these, and a lot of great artisanship or craft went into making them. So Shang religion was focused on worshiping spirits. So it had this kind of animistic quality to it. They did believe in a supreme spirit, though, known as Shang Di. So Shang Di was regarded as the king or the emperor of the other spirits, and as the ancestor, actually, of the ruling class, who were called the Shang. But beneath Shang Di were a whole bunch of different gods or spirits. I'm using the words gods and spirits somewhat interchangeably because they're both translations of the Chinese word Shen. Shen literally means spirit, but it can also refer to beings that would be considered gods in ordinary English usage. So there was kind of a split or division between heavenly or celestial spirits and earthly or nature spirits. And this seems to have started in the Shang dynasty, but it continued all the way up through the rest of the history of traditional Chinese religion. So the heavenly or celestial spirits are those associated with literally things in the sky, like the sun, the moon, planets, stars, constellations. And so each of these would have a different god or goddess associated with it. The nature spirits included spirits of things on the earth. So that would be rivers, mountains, things like that, oceans, potentially forests or trees. And then a third class of spirits was those that were basically deceased humans. So these are ancestor spirits. And they would be given offerings by their descendants. Basically, each clan or extended family would share an altar where they would worship their ancestors. And the ancestor spirits could also be involved in divination. So you could ask them questions and they might give you answers. There is a belief that bad luck, misfortune, disease would be caused by harmful spirits. Now, these would, like in animistic religions, these weren't necessarily demons. These were spirits that were angry or upset for some reason. So the same spirit might either help you or harm you based on, what you had done to it or its attitude toward you. So ritual was very important in this religion. The word for ritual in Chinese is li. And the belief was that if you performed rituals correctly, you would keep the spirits happy, and you could also accumulate spiritual power, or da, by performing these rituals. So it became important to figure out what the correct rituals were, how to perform them. Divination was also really important for the ancient Shang culture and religion. So in modern times, the actual method of Shang divination was discovered because it was different from the usual method used in China, which is based on the Book of Changes, or I Ching. During the Shang dynasty, they actually had a divination method based on writing words on bones. So when these were discovered, unearthed accidentally by later Chinese, they didn't know what they were, so they called them dragon bones. Dragons are these kind of mythical creatures in Chinese culture who can kind of fly around. They can go between, they're kind of like serpents, but they can fly through the sky. They're also often regarded as spirits who rule over rivers or seas. But that was just because there was writing on them that couldn't be read, and it was thought, oh, maybe this is like heavenly or spiritual writing, and so maybe it's the bones of dragons, but it's actually bones of oxes or tortoise shells, things like that. And the Shang would write their questions that they wanted answered on the bones, and then they would heat up like an iron rod or poker until it became glowing red. They would touch the rod onto the bone, and cracks would form on the surface. And the pattern of these cracks would be interpreted by ritual experts as answers to the question. So it was this very kind of elaborate ritual method. These characters you can see written on the bones are different from later Chinese, but they serve basically as the basis. They did influence the forms of Chinese characters that we still have today. So they're kind of like an ancient system of Chinese writing. And in the Shang religion, the king would perform a important ritual role. Like he actually was regarded as someone who could interpret the bones potentially or write the questions on the bones himself. So the Shang dynasty lasted for many centuries. And I mentioned that the king did have this kind of ritual role. So they were regarded as potentially, sacred figures. They were intermediaries between the human kingdom and the world of the spirits. So they had a great deal of kind of religious authority backing them up as well. But eventually, the Shang had a really bad ruler who's called King Chou of Shang, or Di Xin. And like Tyrant Jia, he was associated with self-indulgence. He drank too much alcohol. He engaged in wild sexual orgies. One of the stories told about him is that he had a pool of wine in a forest of meat created for himself. A giant pool that was completely filled with wine. It was so big he could row around in the pool on his boat. In the middle of the pool there was an island on which he had planted trees, and tied to the branches of the trees were actually roasted meats. So as he was sailing past the trees on the island, he could reach out and grab a meat and eat it. So, this is probably not historically accurate, but it illustrates how he was regarded by later generations of scholars as someone who was really indulgent and excessive. He was also tyrannical. So one illustration of this is one of his ministers was a scholar named Bi Gan. And this scholar was trying to persuade Di Xin to change his ways, to reform himself so he could benefit the kingdom. And Di Xin said, "Oh, your advice is very wise. You must be a sage." A sage meaning like a supremely wise person. And there was a tradition in China that a sage would have a heart that was shaped differently from a normal person. A normal person has two main openings in their heart. But it was believed that the heart of a sage had 7 openings. And so Di Xin says, if you're a sage, then your heart will have 7 openings. Let's open you up and see. So he actually had Bi Gan killed, put to death, by having his heart literally cut out from his body when he was still alive. So this is a gruesome execution method. So because of these excesses, Di Xin lost the mandate of heaven. And according to the later accounts, he was easily defeated in battle by King Wu of Chou. So King Wu basically was the founder of the Chou dynasty. He was someone who was tired of the abuses of Di Xin, raised an army to defeat him. Now, Di Xin is also called King Chou, but he actually has no relation to the next dynasty. It's a different word in Chinese, King Chou of Shang versus the Chou dynasty. So King Wu of Chou, it's a different Chou, but it just is spelled the same when it's transliterated into English.